This is indeed a fascinating and pivotal issue from the early Cold War period. In fact, after the outbreak of the Korean War in 1950, Chiang Kai-shek repeatedly expressed his desire to send troops to join the war, but U.S. President Harry S. Truman firmly refused. Below are the respective explanations of why Chiang wanted to participate and why the U.S. rejected his proposal. Reasons Chiang Kai-shek wanted to join the Korean War. The Korean War broke out on June 25, 1950, less than a year after the Chinese Civil War had ended and the ROC government had retreated to Taiwan. Chiang hoped to use the war as an opportunity to retake the mainland. His motivations can be summarized as follows: to counterattack the mainland. Chiang believed the Korean War symbolized a full-scale confrontation between the Communist bloc and the free world. If Communist China sent troops to support North Korea, which it later did, Chiang hoped to join the UN forces and launch a southern invasion of coastal China, e.g., Fujian or Guangdong, with U.S. assistance to overthrow the communist regime. In essence, he sought to turn the Korean War into an extension of the Chinese Civil War, to regain international legitimacy and status. At that time, the People's Republic of China had just been established, and the question of who represented China was still debated internationally. If ROC forces could fight under the United Nations banner, it would emphasize that the Republic of China remained the legitimate government of China. This would greatly strengthen Taiwan's diplomatic recognition and international position. To secure U.S. military aid. Before 1950, the U.S. had already begun abandoning aid to Taiwan. Truman had declared in January that the U.S. would not intervene in the Chinese Civil War. However, the outbreak of the Korean War made Washington reconsider the importance of the East Asian defense line. Chiang thus hoped that participating in the war would bring renewed U.S. aid and a formal defense alliance. 2. Reasons the U.S. rejected Chiang's proposal. President Truman and Secretary of State Dean Acheson were wary of Chiang's offer to intervene. Their reasons for refusal included, to prevent the war from expanding. Truman's primary goal was to limit the scope of the conflict and prevent it from escalating into World War III. If Chiang's forces attacked the Chinese mainland from Taiwan, it would directly provoke the communist regime. This could have led to full-scale intervention by China and the Soviet Union, expanding the conflict into a major East Asian war. Lack of trust in Chiang's competence and motives. The U.S. was unimpressed by Chiang's failure during the Chinese Civil War, viewing his regime as corrupt and militarily ineffective. Truman and Acheson suspected that Chiang's real goal was to restore his power, not to genuinely support the UN mission. They did not want the Korean War to be tainted by the domestic politics of the Chinese Civil War. To maintain the legitimacy of the UN operation. Officially, the Korean War was a UN police action aimed at repelling aggression. Allowing the ROC to fight the PRC would turn the conflict into a Chinese Civil War in the eyes of the world. This would undermine the moral and legal legitimacy of the UN's mission. Strategic considerations. The importance of Taiwan. The U.S. decided to send the 7th Fleet to the Taiwan Strait to prevent both a communist invasion of Taiwan and any ROC attack on the mainland. This strategy stabilized Taiwan's situation and allowed the U.S. to focus its resources on Korea. If Chiang's troops left Taiwan, it would expose the island to communist retaliation. 3. Consequences and impact. On June 27, 1950, Truman ordered the 7th Fleet to patrol the Taiwan Strait, effectively protecting Taiwan while restricting Chiang's actions. Although disappointed, Chiang still benefited from being seen as an anti-communist ally, receiving substantial U.S. military aid and later signing the Sino-American Mutual Defense Treaty in 1954. Ultimately, the Republic of China did not officially participate in the Korean War. Summary: Perspective position. Chiang Kai-shek wanted to use the Korean War to retake the mainland, regain international status, and obtain U.S. aid. Truman aimed to limit the war, distrusted Chiang, avoided provoking China and the USSR, and sought to protect Taiwan. Chiang Kai-shek and the Korean War, ambition and restraint in early Cold War East Asia. The question of whether Chiang Kai-shek's Republic of China should have participated in the Korean War is both fascinating and revealing of early Cold War dynamics. After the war broke out in June 1950, Chiang repeatedly expressed his desire to send troops, hoping to fight alongside the United Nations forces. However, his proposal was firmly rejected by U.S. President Harry S. Truman. The episode illustrates the conflicting strategic goals of the ROC and the United States. Chiang sought to use the Korean conflict to reclaim the Chinese mainland, while Washington aimed to contain the war and avoid escalation with China or the Soviet Union. Chiang Kai-shek's motivations for joining the Korean War. The Korean War erupted less than a year after the Chinese Civil War ended and the ROC government retreated to Taiwan. For Chiang, the outbreak presented what seemed to be a historic opportunity to reverse his fortunes and regain lost territory. His motivations can be summarized as follows. The hope of counterattacking the mainland. Chiang perceived the Korean War as a decisive confrontation between the Communist bloc and the free world. Once the People's Republic of China, PRC, intervened militarily in support of North Korea, Chiang proposed to join the UN forces and launch an amphibious invasion along China's southern coast, in provinces such as Fujian or Guangdong, with American backing. In essence, he sought to transform the Korean War into an extension of the Chinese Civil War, turning it into a second front against the communist regime. The quest for international legitimacy. At that time, the issue of China's legitimate representation in the international community was still unsettled. The ROC continued to hold China's seat in the United Nations, but the newly founded PRC was gaining recognition. By sending troops under the UN banner, Chiang hoped to demonstrate that the Republic of China remained the rightful government of China, thereby strengthening Taiwan's diplomatic standing and international legitimacy. The desire for renewed American support. Earlier in 1950, the Truman administration had declared that the United States would not intervene in the Chinese Civil War and would withdraw military assistance from Taiwan. However, the Korean War abruptly shifted U.S. strategic priorities in East Asia. Chiang therefore sought to leverage participation in the conflict as a way to restore American aid and eventually secure a formal defense commitment from Washington. 2. Reasons for the U.S. rejection. While Truman and Secretary of State Dean Acheson recognized Taiwan's strategic value, they viewed Chiang's proposal with deep skepticism. The U.S. decision to refuse ROC participation stemmed from several key concerns. Preventing escalation of the war. The foremost U.S. objective was to contain the conflict within the Korean Peninsula and avoid any confrontation that might trigger a global war with China or the Soviet Union. If Chiang's forces attacked the mainland, the PRC would inevitably retaliate, potentially drawing the USSR into a broader East Asian conflagration. Distrust of Chiang's competence and motives. American officials had been disillusioned by Chiang's poor leadership and military failures during the Chinese Civil War. They regarded the nationalist regime as corrupt and ineffective, and they suspected that Chiang's true motive was to restore his political power rather than to serve the UN cause. Allowing him to participate risked turning an international police action into a continuation of China's internal conflict. Preserving the legitimacy of the United Nations mission. Officially, the Korean War was conducted under the UN's authority as a collective effort to repel aggression. Permitting the ROC to fight against the PRC would have appeared to the world as Chinese fighting Chinese, undermining the UN's image of neutrality and collective defense. Truman thus sought to preserve the moral and legal legitimacy of the UN intervention. Strategic considerations. The defense of Taiwan. The United States viewed Taiwan as a crucial outpost for regional stability. On June 27, 1950, Truman ordered the U.S. 7th Fleet to patrol the Taiwan Strait, both to deter a communist invasion and to prevent ROC forces from launching attacks on the mainland. This policy effectively secured Taiwan's defense while limiting Chiang's operational freedom, ensuring that American resources remained focused on the Korean front. 3. Consequences and historical significance. Although frustrated by the U.S. decision, Chiang ultimately benefited from the new geopolitical environment created by the Korean War. His government became a key anti-communist ally, receiving substantial American military and economic assistance in the following years. By 1954, the two nations had signed the Sino-American Mutual Defense Treaty, formally placing Taiwan under the U.S. defense umbrella. Despite not participating directly in the Korean War, the ROC's strategic survival and alignment with the United States were secured as a result of the conflict. Conclusion. Perspective. Position. Chiang Kai-shek sought to exploit the Korean War as an opportunity to retake the mainland, restore legitimacy, and gain U.S. aid. Harry S. Truman aimed to contain the war, distrusted Chiang's leadership, avoided provoking China and the USSR, and prioritized the defense of Taiwan. The episode exemplifies the tension between nationalist ambition and superpower restraint in the early Cold War era. While Chiang's hopes for a counteroffensive were thwarted, the U.S. policy of limited war ensured that the Korean conflict remained regional, laying the foundations for Taiwan's long-term security within the American strategic order.
China's position in the Russia-Ukraine war. China's stance toward the Russia-Ukraine war is neither a simple case of supporting Ukraine nor of fully siding with Russia. Rather, it is a complex, strategic, and dual-layered diplomatic posture. Below is a summary of its main positions, motivations, and practical actions. China's official position 1. China emphasizes respect for national sovereignty and territorial integrity. 2. At the same time, China asserts that all countries' legitimate security concerns, including those raised by Russia, should be taken seriously. 3. China consistently calls for ceasefire negotiations, peaceful resolution, opposition to escalation, and resistance to the expansion of military blocs. 4. In February 2023, China released the position paper on the political settlement of the Ukraine crisis, presenting 12 broad principles, though it did not directly condemn Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. 2. Contradictions and deeper motives behind China's actions. Although China maintains an appearance of neutrality and non-involvement, multiple reports suggest that it is de facto leaning toward supporting Russia or at least preventing a major Russian defeat. China is a crucial energy and trade partner for Russia. When the US and Europe imposed sanctions, China became a key market and sanctions-evading channel for Russian exports. Chinese companies have been accused of supplying dual-use goods to Russia's defense industry, such as drone components and machine tools, though Beijing denies providing direct weaponry. Analysts note that China's support for Russia also serves a strategic purpose: to divert Western attention and resources to Europe, thereby reducing pressure on China in the Indo-Pacific region. 3. Why China takes this position, interests and strategic calculations. Strategic and security considerations. China views its relationship with Russia as part of a broader effort to counterbalance the West, particularly the United States. Keeping Russia engaged in a protracted struggle with the West benefits China by distracting Western focus from the Asia-Pacific. At the same time, China prefers stability along its northern and western borders, so maintaining a steady partnership with Russia serves its geopolitical interests. Observing lessons for Taiwan and potential expansion. Some commentators argue that China uses the war as a learning opportunity to study how a major power conducts multi-domain warfare, withstands Western sanctions, and employs information warfare. These observations could prove valuable if China were to consider actions toward Taiwan. Economic and energy interests. As Western markets restrict Russian exports, China benefits from discounted energy supplies, strengthening its energy security and bargaining power. The growing energy trade also deepens Sino-Russian economic interdependence. 4. Risks and external criticism. Ukraine and Western nations criticize China's neutrality as a facade masking real support for Russia, arguing that China indirectly fuels Moscow's war machine. Should Russia suffer a major defeat or be forced into large concessions, China reportedly fears that a Western victory in Europe would free U.S. resources for greater pressure on Asia. China's peace initiatives, while diplomatically appealing, have been criticized for lacking concrete mechanisms, enforcement power, and credibility, particularly because they avoid holding Russia accountable. Summary. China's position can be summarized as follows: outwardly neutral and advocating peace talks, but substantively leaning toward Russia, seeking to divide Western attention, safeguard regional interests, and maintain strategic leverage against the United States. Follow-up commentary. You observe that Russia may seize upon Donald Trump's desire for a ceasefire to demand more occupied territories from Ukraine. This is indeed plausible. In such a case, China would likely tacitly accept Russia's retention of existing occupied areas as long as it does not destabilize global markets. Beijing would then position itself as a peace facilitator, while quietly ensuring that the geopolitical balance remains favorable to its long-term strategy.
I think so as well. Russia is clearly taking advantage of Donald Trump's desire to bring about a ceasefire, attempting to leverage that momentum to extort more territory from Ukraine. What remains uncertain is how China will respond. Your observation is very sharp. Indeed, the current stage of the Russia-Ukraine war marks a critical phase of diplomatic and strategic maneuvering, and China's attitude plays a subtle yet pivotal role. Let me analyze China's possible stance and underlying considerations. China's overall position, superficially neutral, substantively pro-Russia in its official rhetoric. China consistently advocates for mediation and promotion of peace talks, respect for national sovereignty and territorial integrity, and opposition to Cold War thinking and unilateral sanctions. Although these statements sound neutral, China's diplomatic and economic behavior has clearly leaned toward Russia. For instance, it has never condemned Russia's invasion and abstained from UN votes condemning Moscow. China has maintained frequent high-level exchanges with Russia, Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin have referred to their nations as having a no-limit strategic partnership. Economic cooperation has expanded significantly. Following Western sanctions, China became Russia's largest export market, purchasing discounted oil and natural gas. Hence, China's position can be summarized as not openly supportive, but practically helpful. 2. China's strategic calculations. China's actions in this conflict are guided primarily by its own national interests, containing the United States and NATO. As long as the Russia-Ukraine war continues, U.S. and European strategic attention remains tied up in Europe. This helps divert American focus and pressure away from the Indo-Pacific, especially the Taiwan Strait. Preserving the strategic value of the Sino-Russian partnership. Russia serves as a key strategic partner for China in resisting Western containment. Should Russia suffer a major defeat leading to Putin's fall or regime instability, China would lose a crucial anti-U.S. ally. Maintaining an image of respectability in the international order. China still seeks to sustain economic relations with Europe and developing nations. Therefore, it aims to project a neutral and peace-loving image, avoiding direct military support for Russia. 3. China's possible response if the U.S. pushes for a ceasefire. If the United States were to actively pursue a ceasefire, China would likely adopt a go-along cautiously attitude. Publicly, it would support peace talks, portraying itself as a peace broker or responsible major power. Privately, it would observe whether Russia can consolidate its territorial gains, even tacitly accepting Russian control over occupied regions such as Crimea or Donbass. If Trump returns to power and scales back U.S. aid to Ukraine, China might interpret this as a decline in American global influence, thus seeking to strengthen the Sino-Russian front against the U.S. In short, China presents itself as a neutral peace advocate, but in practice leans toward Russia, supporting it strategically and economically while leveraging the war to distract the West and enhance its own geopolitical position.